They came in darkness to burn his past to the ground, but they never considered what awaited them at first light. This land has a long memory. It recalls every footprint that ever pressed into its dust, every crack of a rifle that ever split its silence. Men would ride through believing it was vacant, only to discover, when it was too late, that it had been observing them all along. On the valley's remote edge, where the earth sloped down to a parched stream and the hills hunched like weary giants, there was a ranch the world had largely forgotten. The fences tilted, the porch drooped, the barn stood dark and broad-shouldered, bearing the marks of endless seasons under sun and wind. People passed by without a second thought, sure that nothing important remained there. The man who lived there moved quietly, as if anxious not to disturb the spirits that inhabited the land alongside him. He awoke before sunrise and retired soon after sunset. He never initiated conversation, and when he did speak, his words were few and measured, like supplies saved for a harsh season. His hair was the shade of charcoal ash. His posture had a slight bend that led strangers to underestimate him. To the nearby town, he was harmless, a relic the years had overlooked and kindness had spared. What they failed to perceive were the burdens he carried, heavier than the weight of age. A wife resting under a cottonwood by the creek. A child who never took a step on this soil. The sound of joy that once echoed through the home, now reduced to the moan of wind through gaping planks. Grief had emptied him, but it had not shattered him. It had instructed him in patience. It had schooled him in silence. Some wounds hollow a man, but they also teach him to wait. That evening, a restless desert breeze swept across the valley floor, its cold touch stirring the tall grass and making the loose boards of the barn groan with a low, anxious sound. The moon rose slowly, washed out and pale, throwing elongated shadows that pooled like spilled ink over the ground. Far away, a coyote yipped, its call frail and isolated, and the noise lingered in the air even after the creature had gone quiet. The old rancher had just dimmed the lantern and sunk into his chair when the noise reached him, muffled at first, almost like distant storm rolls. Hoofbeats. Not the steady tempo of a passerby, or the wary advance of a friend, but the reckless stampede of males who thought the nighttime was theirs alone. He didn't stand up. He didn't grab for a weapon. He just listened, tallying the rhythm, sensing the tremor through the floorboards as if the soil itself was talking. They arrived with laughter, voices slurred by alcohol and malice, slicing through the blackness like shattered pain. 5 horsemen halted near the barn, their steeds snorting and pawing, nervous from the scent of impending violence. One rider spat on the dirt and kicked a fence post, splintering it. "Look at this dump," he snarled. Another jeered, "The old-timer's halfway to the grave already. We might as well put him out of his misery." They didn't even glance at the house. To them, it was hollow in all ways that counted. One man lit a match, the flame blooming sudden and bright, a tiny star in his grip. He flung it into the dry hay pile beside the barn wall. The fire accepted greedily, sprinting across the straw with a voracious crackle. In moments, amber light erupted against the wood, shadows dancing and twisting as if possessed. The livestock sensed it first. Horses whinnied and kicked, their fear acute and piercing. A mule brayed, the noise ragged with alarm. Smoke coiled, dense and acrid, bearing the odor of burned work, of harvests gathered and stored, now vanishing into a single thoughtless chuckle. The lawless men hooped while the flames mounted, heating their faces, rendering their smiles savage. From the shadows next to the home, the old rancher observed. The fire's glow sculpted his face into planes of light and dark, showing eyes that mirrored the inferno without a flicker. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. His hands stayed at his sides, fingers gradually clenching into fists with every beam that snapped and fell. He experienced the loss like a bodily impact, decades turning to cinder, but he allowed the anguish to flow through him silently. Agony, he had discovered, shouts loudest when you give it a voice. One of the arsonists finally looked toward the house and chuckled. "The old coot's likely hiding under his mattress," he said. "Let him look on. Maybe he'll get the message about clearing out." They galloped away before the roof succumbed. Their merriment faded into the ridges, certain the valley would absorb their misdeed as it always had. The blaze consumed until there was nothing left to devour. When the final beam gave way and the flames dwindled to coals, the ranch stood transformed, a charred gash upon the earth. By morning, talk would get to town, borne on hushed tones and startled expressions. People would nod solemnly and whisper about wicked men and rotten fortune. Someone would claim it was inevitable. Another would insist they'd overheard the gang intending to return. Perhaps seize the property now that opposition had been turned to smoke. No one would propose assistance. No one ever did. Dread had become the town's native tongue, spoken openly and without embarrassment. The old rancher waited until the wind stilled and the embers lost their heat. Only then did he stir. He traversed the yard slowly, boots crushing over seared soil, and entered the barn's skeleton. The odor was dense and absolute. He halted where the flooring had caved in, then kneeled and swept away soot with meticulous attention. Under the wreckage, concealed where flames couldn't readily penetrate, sat a squat, iron-reinforced box. He raised the cover, and moonlight glinted on blued metal and polished wood. The rifle lay there as it always had, enormous and pristine, its lengthy barrel as dark as a tranquil pond at daybreak. A buffalo rifle crafted for range and assurance, for an era when conflicts were resolved with deliberation, not hurry. He stroked it, not with tenderness, but with recognition, like meeting an old friend whose name you've always remembered. As the heavens started to brighten, and the initial slender stripe of sunrise stole over the hills, the valley seemed to pause. The fire had claimed plenty, but not all. Certain things, it appeared, were merely biding their time for the illumination. Some weapons are buried not from fear, but from respect for what they can do. Morning infiltrated the valley like a reluctant observer. Faint lights spilled over the elevations and settled on the remnants with hushed deference. Smoke still spiraled from the barn's skeleton, gray tendrils rising and melting into the chill air. Ash floated over the plains, gentle as winter flakes, settling on the grass, sticking to fence posts, covering the ground and the ruins of what had been constructed by sweat and perseverance. The terrain smelled of absence, of charred timber, scorched fodder, and something more ancient, more grave, like a caution riding the gust. The old rancher stood where the barn once was, the rifle cradled in his hands. In daytime, it seemed even more imposing than under the moon. Its barrel lengthy and rigid, its stock stained by years of maintenance. He didn't hoist it yet. He merely held it, sensing the heft he had once known more intimately than anything else in his existence. Around him, the valley was mute, as if it also recalled what that rifle signified. There was a period when his name was uttered with caution, when range itself appeared to curve to his benefit. Long before he became the silent man on a neglected spread, he had traversed the prairies with intent, following bison packs and more dangerous beasts with the same unwavering gaze. In those days, the rifle wasn't a treasure stashed under floorboards, but an instrument worn openly, regarded, and dreaded. He had realized early that haste was a youthful delusion. Accuracy belonged to those who mastered patience. He recollected the initial time he'd made a shot at a span others deemed unfeasible. The breeze had been tricky that day, the air wavering with warmth, but he had aimed the way a scholar reads sacred text. Inhale, exhale. The trigger had yielded smoothly, and the report had rumbled over the country like a storm. After that, his fame had spread wider than he ever traveled. Some labeled him a hunter, others employed grimmer terms. He never argued. The rifle had witnessed more than wildlife. It had concluded disputes before they escalated into battles. It had halted men who thought brutality made them powerful. Every discharge had been selected, never frivolous. The rifle didn't excuse rashness, and he had adopted that principle. When the woman he adored entered his life, he had willingly stored the firearm away, thinking that chapter concluded. When she perished, and the infant with her, he had secured the rifle, terrified of what sorrow might make him if he heeded its summons too intently. Now, standing in the ashes, he felt the tug anew, not from fury, but from obligation. The fire hadn't stirred a hunger for blood. It had ripped off the falsehood that tranquility could survive when brutality went unchallenged. He shut his eyes and saw her visage, not as it was at the finale, but as it had been at the start, firm, faithful, fearless. He had vowed to her once that he was finished with slaughter. He pondered now if she would grasp the distinction between murder and preventing. He walked the boundary slowly, boots grinding through cinder and burned dirt, interpreting the terrain as he always did. Hoofprints narrated their tale plainly in the soft earth beyond the scorched area. 5 horses, burdened, shod clumsily. One creature favored its left hind leg, the impression shallow and irregular. The men hadn't attempted to conceal their trail. They never did. Terror had made them sloppy. Convinced nobody would pursue, he followed the prints eastward toward the gorge passage where the land constricted and the stone cliffs ascended like clenched hands. The route channeled noise and motion, a spot where span could be calculated and managed. He ascended partway up the bluff, evaluating sight lines, judging angles, feeling the breeze on his skin. It moved softly from the north, consistent enough to rely on. He nodded once, resolution solidifying within him like bedrock. By noon, the town hummed with nervous chatter. Smoke on the skyline had attracted stares, but no one had ridden out. In the tavern, males conversed in subdued tones, shooting looks toward the entrance as if anticipating calamity to walk in on its own. Someone named the gang, then went silent. Another grumbled that the elderly rancher ought to have known better than to remain alone out there. Nobody offered to investigate. Nobody lent a firearm. The fugitives, meanwhile, relaxed under cottonwood trees miles distant, boots removed, self-assurance intact. They joked about the fire, reiterating it like a cherished anecdote. One suggested they return at daybreak to see if the old fool had finally run off. Another proposed taking the land completely, making it a stronghold none would risk opposing. They drank and schemed, never once imagining that the night hadn't closed the narrative. As the sun lowered once more, the rancher went home only briefly to collect what he required. He cleaned the rifle with skilled hands, lubricating the metal, inspecting the sights, making sure each component responded precisely as it should. He packed water, a little food, and nothing more. Surplus was a load. He locked the cabin behind him, though he suspected no one would approach it now. He arrived at the canyon before sunrise, the sky still tinted with purple and gray. He climbed to the selected lookout, a slim shelf overlooking the pass, and settled in. The rifle lay across a natural stone bench, perfectly positioned. Beneath him, the trail awaited, vacant and hushed, holding the pledge of what would soon arrive. As the earliest glow broke along the edge, the valley seemed to halt. Birds quieted. The wind dropped. The old rancher smoothed his breathing and peered through the scope, perceiving not merely distance and form, but outcome. He didn't know how the day would conclude, only that it wouldn't go without a reply. Some conflagrations are designed to obliterate, others are meant to commemorate. The sun topped the hills like a slowly kindling coin, pouring gold into the gorge and extracting lengthy shadows from the rock faces. Dust appeared first, a faint haze drifting ahead of the horsemen. Then the sound followed. Hooves striking stone, leather straining, a heedless melody half-sung and already discarded. 5 outlines moved into the pass, black against the glare, their forms slack with arrogance. They rode as males who believed the globe had already curved to their will. They laughed as they advanced, voices reverberating and multiplying off the canyon walls, transforming petty taunts into something nastier and more grating. One of them gestured back toward the valley and remarked about smoke still hanging in the air. Another ridiculed how the old rancher must have stood viewing, shaking, powerless. Their amusement traveled readily in the thin dawn air, oblivious it was being calibrated and assessed. High above, embedded in the stone, the old rancher lay motionless. The rifle rested accurate, its long barrel steady on the rock. He had been there long enough for his respiration to sync with the canyon's tempo. Slow and enduring, he didn't view them as humans. He saw geometry, spans, airflow. He saw the slight uplift in the path where a hoof would pause. The instant where glee would shift to bewilderment. He awaited the correct moment, not because he liked waiting, but because he honored what followed. The first rider crossed the invisible boundary he had plotted in his thoughts. The rancher drew breath once, profound and serene, then released it halfway. The universe contracted to the ring of lens and metal, to the mild tension of his finger on the trigger. When the shot arrived, it didn't snap so much as swell, a deep roar that saturated the canyon and pursued itself in reverberations. The recoil pushed into his shoulder, familiar and mastered as the noise sped outward like a judgment. The front rider disappeared from the saddle as if the earth had inhaled him. His horse shrieked and rose, hurling dust and frenzy into the atmosphere. For a pulse, the others immobilized, unable to locate the sound, unable to comprehend distance or course. Then the echoes came back, bouncing and layering, and dread located them simultaneously. "Take cover," someone yelled, though nobody knew where cover truly was. The second shot arrived before the utterance finished. Another controlled breath, another clean release. A rider twisted sideways, skull jerking, form collapsing against stone. Horses bolted, reins tearing free as pandemonium ripped through the tight passage. Men shouted names, oaths, supplications, their voices tiny against the vastness of the gorge. The rancher operated the rifle without rush. Each motion was intentional, rehearsed beyond cognition. He didn't pursue them with the barrel. He let them advance into his forbearance. A third shot spanned unthinkable range, striking its target with the same mute certainty as the initial two. Dust poofed from rock, then crimson speckled briefly and disappeared, borne off by the morning gust. They scattered then, attempting to wheel their mounts, crashing into each other, imprisoned by the very walls that had once made them feel invincible. Bullets discharged wildly upward, fracturing stone, sending fragments skittering down the incline, but none came near. The rancher adjusted once, marginally, accommodating for the change in breeze as the sun rose higher. Another shot. Another rider dropped. The canyon filled with the noises of horror. Horses screeching, men pleading, boots scuffing futilely on stone. The surviving two tried to escape together, spurring their beasts toward the distant curve, but the pass permitted no velocity, no shelter. The rancher waited until they split, until one dragged half a length behind. The fifth shot terminated the flight for one of them, slamming him down hard into the dust. Silence flooded in where clamor had been, interrupted only by the frantic panting of the final man alive. He slid from his horse and pressed himself against the rock face, eyes wide, hands trembling as he groped for his pistol. He screamed into the canyon, demanding to know who was hunting him, his voice breaking and feeble. "You burned my barn," the rancher stated softly, though he knew the man couldn't hear him. The words were for himself, for the land, for the recollection of what had been stolen. The last man ran. He picked the poorest possible route, clambering upward along a scant-goat trail that led nearer to the rifle's vantage. The rancher rose now, shouldering the weapon, moving with the fluidity of someone who had done this long ago, and never unlearned it. He stepped from a ledge and commenced the cautious descent, boots locating holds where none seemed to exist. They saw each other finally near an outcrop where the path tapered to nothing. The outlaw whirled, revolver raised, eyes crazed, face streaked with sweat and dirt. He froze when he truly saw the figure before him. Not a quivering casualty, not a specter, but an elderly man standing composed with a rifle that appeared unreal in its magnitude. "It was just a barn," the outlaw stammered. "Just a fire. I didn't know." The rancher didn't elevate the rifle yet. He examined the man's countenance, seeking something that might halt his hand. He found only terror, crude and self-centered, the same expression he'd witnessed too often before. "You knew," he said, his voice firm and clear in the thin atmosphere. "You always know." The outlaw's finger tightened. The shot went astray, caroming harmlessly off the canyon wall. The rancher raised the rifle then, the action fluid and ultimate. The man attempted to speak again, but the sound never fully formed. The final shot resonated longer than the others, rolling through the gorge and out into the awakening valley beyond. When the noise dissipated, it left behind a quiet that felt deserved. The rancher stood alone among stone and sky, the rifle warm against his shoulder. He gazed down at the pass, at the forms lying where hubris had positioned them, and felt no victory, only closure. The land had uttered, and he had heeded. As the sun climbed higher, its illumination cleansed the canyon, disclosing the reality of what had occurred. Somewhere far below, the valley stirred, oblivious that a myth had briefly emerged from stillness, accomplished what was necessary, and was already turning back toward quiet. Justice isn't always loud, sometimes it's the last echo of a long-awaited shot. Silence pursued the last reverberation, profound and total, as if the canyon had shut its jaws. Dust wafted idly in the morning radiance, softening the severe edges of rock and gore alike. The sun ascended further, spreading warmth into zones that moments before had known only fright, and the terrain seemed to inhale anew. Where mirth and gunplay had dominated, there was now merely the sigh of wind and the enduring tolerance of stone. The old rancher remained for a lengthy span without stirring. He didn't look down at the defeated men. He looked outward across the valley where the light expanded in broadening ribbons of gold. The rifle leaned against his shoulder, weightier now, not from use, but from remembrance. When he at last turned from the canyon passage, his strides were slow and purposeful, as if he were abandoning something that couldn't accompany him. By the time the initial riders from town appeared, the sun was fully above the ridges. They approached warily, two at first, then more, drawn by rumors carried on fright and smoke. No one spoke as they entered the pass. Their horses slowed, sensing what their riders hadn't yet fully understood. Eyes widened, hats were removed. Someone made the sign of the cross without knowing why. They found the bodies where the land had deposited them. 5 males who had once ridden noisy and certain now lay dispersed and diminished, their might reduced to motionlessness. The townsfolk dismounted in stunned muteness, revolving in slow circles as if expecting the canyon to clarify itself. Murmurs commenced then, shaky and fragile. Who did this? No posse rides like that. Only one man could have. The words faded as they noticed the figure waiting at the far side of the pass. The old rancher stood there, hat in hand. The rifle hung low across his back. In the full light of day, he appeared smaller than the tale already swelling around him. Just a man molded by years and elements. But when he met their gazes, something held them fixed. No one reached for a firearm. No one raised a voice. The truth was inscribed plainly enough in the terrain surrounding them. "He burned my barn," the rancher said quietly, answering the inquiry no one had yet ventured to pose. "I asked him not to." There was no pride in his tone, no ire left to edge the words. Only fact, only an ending. They rode back together, the townspeople and the man they had once ignored, moving through the valley as if through a territory freshly claimed. News traveled swifter than hoofbeats, borne on faces pale with incredulity and reverence. By midday, every door in town stood ajar. Every eye turned toward the road leading past the ranch. Fear, so long accustomed it had seemed permanent, began to relax its hold. People came then not with weapons but with gifts, timber, fasteners, water. Silent apologies left unspoken but comprehended. They labored without being asked, erecting frames where ashes still smoldered, honoring what had been lost by constructing anew. The rancher accepted the aid without remark. He watched hands work where once there had been only flame, and something in his chest unclenched. That evening, when the task was done, and the sun sank low again, he returned to the house alone. He washed the grime from his hands and sat at the small table by the window, listening to the sounds of a valley no longer afraid to speak. Children giggled somewhere down the lane. A hammer rang once, then fell silent. Life, tenacious and persistent, had recommenced. He retrieved the iron-bound chest and placed it on the floor. The rifle disassembled in his grasp with the ease of long custom. Barrel, stock, action, each piece cleaned, oiled, and arranged meticulously in place. When he closed the lid, it wasn't with finality, but with determination. The tool had spoken when it needed to. It didn't need to speak again. Outside, the day's last light painted the land in tones of copper and rose. The ranch stood marked, but upright, its silhouette sharper now, as if the fire had stripped away only what was frail. The old rancher stepped onto the porch and gazed out across the valley one final time. The breeze lifted his hair, the soil warm under his boots. Legends, the valley would recall, were never born from fury alone. They arose from restraint, from the quiet decision to bear until bearing was no longer sufficient. They belonged to men who possessed dreadful skill and kept it interred until the land itself required it exhumed. The sun dipped completely behind the hills, leaving behind a sky broad and serene. And in that waning glow, justice was inscribed not in crimson but in the simple peace of a frontier finally permitted to rest. If this tale of patience and retribution resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to Winds of Thought for more stories where the land itself has a voice.